I have spent 40 years mourning a life that was stolen by a woman who claimed to love me. The skin on my right thumb is the color of a bruised plum. I rub the knuckle until it burns. This is a habit I cannot break. It is a physical manifestation of a psychic wound. On the side table sits a pair of hand-knitted baby booties. They are made of white wool. They have never been worn by a living child. The yarn has turned the color of old teeth. It is a sickly yellow. I keep them there to remind myself of the weight of a ghost. I keep them there to remember the version of myself that died in 1975. The brass skeleton key to the house on Monument Avenue felt heavy in my palm. This was back in 1974. It was a substantial piece of metal. It was cold and unyielding. It promised a life of permanence and safety. The house was a tall brick Victorian. It had drafty windows that rattled in the wind. The porch always smelled of wet cedar after a storm. Thomas and I moved in during the hottest July on record. The air in Richmond tasted like wet copper. It was thick and metallic. Every afternoon, the sky turned the color of a dark bruise. The thunder rolled over the hills like heavy furniture being moved upstairs. I thought that sound was the soundtrack to my happiness. I was wrong. Thomas was a man who moved with a quiet and deliberate grace. He was a builder. He spent his days out in the sun. He came home smelling of pine sawdust and honest sweat. I loved the way his hands felt against my skin. They were rough and certain. They were the hands of a man who knew how to fix things. We spent our evenings on the porch swing. We drank gin and tonics with too much lime. The ice clinked against the glass. We talked about the children we would have. We picked out names like Clara and Benjamin. We argued about which bedroom would be the nursery. I wanted the one with the morning sun. He wanted the one with the view of the garden. That was the person I thought I knew. I thought I was married to a man of substance. My sister Meredith lived 6 blocks away. She visited every Tuesday for dinner. She was a woman who wore her resentment like a fine silk scarf. It was elegant and suffocating. She sat at our mahogany table and watched Thomas eat. She watched him with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She waited for the silence to stretch. She waited until it was long enough to be uncomfortable. She would look at the blueprints Thomas left on the sideboard. She would run a manicured finger over the lines of his work. Meredith tilted her head and said, "Building birdhouses for the wealthy does not make you an architect, Thomas." Her voice was sharp. It was like a needle under a fingernail. Thomas would keep chewing his food. He never raised his voice. He never gave her the satisfaction of a fight. He would just reach under the table. He would squeeze my hand. I thought her cruelty was a symptom of her own loneliness. She had a string of failed engagements. She had a job at the bank that she hated. I felt sorry for her. I invited her into our lives because I believed family was an unbreakable circle. I believed her jealousy was the only thing standing between me and a perfect marriage. I was a fool. The first signal came on a Tuesday in October. The humidity had finally broken. The air was crisp. It smelled of burning leaves and wood smoke. We were at my parents' house for Sunday dinner. The roast beef was dry. The room was filled with the sounds of silverware hitting plates. Thomas was talking about a new contract. He had signed for a library extension. He was proud of the work. His eyes were bright and full of life. He looked like a man with a future. Meredith put her fork down with a sharp click against the china. The sound echoed in the quiet dining room. She looked at my mother and said, "It is a shame he spends so much time building things for other people's children when he cannot provide any of his own." The room went cold. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. We had been trying to conceive for a year. It was a private ache. It was a conversation we had only in the dark. I had not told her we were struggling. I should have seen it then. I should have wondered how she knew the shape of our secret. Instead, I just looked at the gravy. It was congealing on my plate. I told myself she was just lashing out. By the spring of 1975, the silence in our bedroom had grown heavy. It was a physical weight. Every month was a fresh morning. Every month was a reminder of my failure. Thomas became distant. He stopped smelling like sawdust. He started smelling like old bourbon. He would stay out late at the job site. He would come home and collapse into the guest bed. Meredith became a constant shadow. She was everywhere. She began showing up at my medical appointments. She said she wanted to support me. She said she was the only one who understood my pain. She sat in the waiting room of Dr. Aristos' office. Her legs were crossed perfectly. Her eyes were fixed on the door. The office smelled of floor wax and menthol. It was a sterile and frightening smell. It was always cold in that office. Dr. Aristos was a man with thick glasses. His hands always felt damp. He had been our family physician for 20 years. My father played golf with him at the club. We trusted him with our lives. He was a pillar of the community. I sat on the exam table in a paper gown. The paper crinkled every time I breathed. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound. It was a low and buzzing drone. Dr. Aristos came in with a manila folder. He did not look at me. He did not meet my eyes. He looked at the floor. He looked at his shoes. He cleared his throat and said, "The results are conclusive, Evelyn." He told me I was sterile. He used words like permanent and irreversible. He said my body was a hollow vessel. The heat in the room seemed to vanish. I felt a phantom pain in my chest. I thought of the white booties in my dresser drawer. I thought of the nursery with the light blue wallpaper. My entire future was erased in a single sentence. Meredith was there before the doctor finished speaking. She moved into the room and put her arm around me. Her perfume was cloying. It smelled of lilies and dust. It was the smell of a funeral. She told me it would be okay. She told me she would take care of everything. She went to the pharmacy for me. She spoke to the specialists. She even suggested we see a marriage counselor. She said she knew one from her work at the bank. I went to the counseling sessions in a daze. I was a walking ghost. The counselor was a woman named Dr. Vance. She had a voice like crushed velvet. She focused entirely on Thomas's needs. She talked about the burden of a man who wanted a legacy. She said he had found only a dead end in me. She made me feel like a broken clock. She made me feel like a piece of faulty machinery. Thomas began to look at me with pity. He looked at me with resentment. He did not touch me anymore. He spent more time at the tavern. He would sit there for hours. Meredith was always there to pick him up. She was the one who listened to his frustrations. She was the one who told him he deserved a full life. I watched them from the upstairs window. They stood by his truck in the rain. She held the umbrella over him. She leaned in close to his ear. I felt like a ghost in my own hallways. I felt like a trespasser in my own marriage. I rationalized it. I told myself she was helping him through his grief. I told myself I was lucky to have a sister who stepped in. I was too weak to move. I ignored the way they looked at each other. They shared looks over the rim of their glasses. I ignored the fact that Meredith was suddenly buying expensive jewelry. She was on a bank teller's salary. She had a new gold necklace. She had a diamond ring that she wore on her right hand. I was too broken to see the truth. I was too busy mourning my own body. The break happened on a Friday night in December. The house was freezing. The heating bill was unpaid. The radiator was clanking like a dying engine. It was a rhythmic and metallic banging. I came home from work early. I found Thomas's suitcase in the hallway. It was open on the floor. His shirts were folded neatly inside. His tools were gone from the shed. Thomas stood by the window. He looked out at the street. He said, "I cannot live in a house that feels like a tomb." He did not look at me when he said it. He did not offer a hug or an explanation. He walked out the door. He got into Meredith's car. She was waiting at the curb. The engine was already running. The exhaust was a white cloud in the cold air. I stood on the porch and watched the taillights disappear. They vanished into the fog. I went inside and locked the door. I used the brass skeleton key. The house felt massive and empty. It smelled of nothing. The silence was louder than the radiator. 3 days later, my mother called. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She told me that Meredith and Thomas had announced they were together. They called themselves soulmates. They told the family that their connection was forged in fire. They said it was born from my medical crisis. Meredith told everyone that she was the only one who could give Thomas a family. She told everyone I was mentally unstable. She told our parents I had pushed Thomas away. She said I had become cold and distant. She said I had refused to seek help. My parents did not know what to do. They were horrified by the scandal, but they found it easier to believe her. They wanted to believe that someone was happy. I lived in that silence for a long time. I lost my marriage. I lost my sister. I lost the trust of my friends. They found it easier to believe Meredith's version of the story. It was a clean and surgical removal of my entire life. I am 72 years old now. My hair is the color of salt. My bones ache when the rain comes. Last year, Meredith passed away from a sudden stroke. She died in the house she shared with Thomas for 40 years. They lived in a big house on the edge of town. They never had children. That was the irony that everyone whispered about. They whispered at the funeral. They wondered why the golden couple had remained childless. Thomas sat in the front row. He looked like a man made of gray ash. He was brittle and dry. He did not speak to me. He did not even look my way. I had to help clear out her estate. My parents are long gone. They died years ago. The burden fell to me. I went to the bank where she had worked for 3 decades. The building was old and smelled of money and paper. The manager handed me a small envelope. It was addressed to the estate of Meredith Miller. Inside was a second brass skeleton key. It was tarnished and dull. It was wrapped in a piece of yellowed silk. It belonged to a safety deposit box. X had not been opened since 1976. I went down to the vault. The air was still. It smelled of cold metal and old paper. It was a subterranean silence. I turned the key in the lock. The metal groaned as it moved. I pulled out the heavy metal drawer. Inside the box was a thick stack of documents. They were tied together with a black ribbon. My hands were shaking. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. The first thing I found was a series of bank transfer receipts. They were from Meredith's personal account. They were sent to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The recipient was Dr. Aristos. The dates matched the weeks leading up to my infertility diagnosis. There were thousands of dollars moved in increments, $500 here, $1,000 there. It was a trail of breadcrumbs made of greed. The second thing was a typed letter. It was on the doctor's official stationery. It was a confession. It was dated 2 years before he died. He wrote that Meredith had discovered something about Thomas. She had found a set of old marriage licenses. They were from other states. She found death certificates for 3 different women. The doctor wrote, "Meredith paid me to lie because she found out your husband was a career con artist." I read the words 3 times. I could not breathe. She had evidence that Thomas only married women with substantial life insurance policies. He targeted women from good families. He targeted women with property. He waited until they were pregnant. That was when the accidents happened. He had 3 previous wives. All 3 had died in their 3rd trimester. All 3 had fallen downstairs or drowned in shallow tubs. The insurance companies had paid out every time. He was a predator who used the womb as a hunting ground. Meredith didn't bribe the doctor to steal my husband. She didn't do it out of simple jealousy. She bribed him to make me useless to a predator. She made sure I could never be the target of his final act. She took him for herself because she thought she was smarter than him. She thought she could control him if she was the one holding the secrets. She chose a life of fear to keep me from a grave. She spent 40 years sleeping next to a killer so I wouldn't have to. I sat in the vault for 2 hours. The silence was absolute. I realized that my sister had spent 40 years living a lie. She had sacrificed her reputation. She had sacrificed my love. She had allowed me to hate her. She mocked his achievements because she knew they were built on blood. She knew his library extensions were paid for by dead women. She became the villain of my story so I could be the survivor. She was a monster and a martyr all at once. I found a recovery of encrypted messages. They were on a modern digital drive. She had kept it in the box. She had been tracking his movements for years. She had a file on every woman he talked to. She had a list of every bank account he tried to open. She had spent her entire life as a human shield. She had kept him on a leash of blackmail and silence. She had traded her soul to keep me breathing. I took the brass skeleton key to the bank yesterday morning. I closed the box for the last time. I walked out into the Richmond sun. The humidity was rising. It felt like 1974 all over again. I could hear the cicadas screaming in the trees. It was a wall of sound. I thought about the white booties. I thought about the nursery I never had. I thought about the life I spent in mourning for a body that was never broken. I drove to the cemetery. I stood at Meredith's grave. The dirt was still fresh and dark. There were no flowers on the mound. I didn't feel forgiveness. I didn't feel gratitude. I just felt the weight of 40 years of wasted air. I looked at the knuckle of my thumb. It was bright red from rubbing. I wanted to scream at the headstone. I wanted to thank her and hit her at the same time. She had saved my life and ruined it simultaneously. I went back to the house on Monument Avenue. It is my house again now. Thomas was sitting on the porch swing. He is an old man now. He looks fragile and thin. His hands shake when he holds his tea. He smiled at me as I walked up the path. It was the same smile he gave me 40 years ago. It was a mask that never slipped. Thomas looked at the sky and said, "It looks like rain, Evelyn." His voice was thin and ready. It was the voice of a man who had outlived his victims. I didn't answer him. I reached into my pocket. I felt the cold metal of the key. I wondered if he knew that I knew. I wondered if he was still waiting. I wondered if he was waiting for the right moment to finally finish his work. I sat down in the porch swing next to him. The wood groaned under our weight. We sat there in the heat. We watched the clouds gather on the horizon. The sky turned the color of a dark bruise. I realized we were both just waiting for the storm to break. I reached out and took his hand. It was cold. It felt like a piece of dead wood. I held it tight. I did not let go. The sun set over the Richmond skyline. The shadows stretched across the porch. We sat there like two old friends. We sat there like a husband and wife who had no secrets. I am 72 years old. I am not a mother. I am not a wife. I am a survivor of a war. I didn't know I was fighting. I will sit here until the rain starts. I will sit here until the end.